and gentlemen, Dajia, it's truly an honor to be here today. I moved from Canada to Taiwan a little more than 11 years ago, and ever since that time, I really have struggled as a journalist, as a writer, and as a human being to find a proper definition for what peace means in the Taiwan-strait. Perhaps unlike anywhere else on the planet, the Taiwan-strait truly challenges the very definition of what peace means, or at least the rather simplistic way we oftentimes use to refer to that term. This is a term, peace, that politicians on both sides of the Taiwan-strait, in Beijing and Taipei, have used and abused repeatedly over the years. During the 8 years of the President Ma Ying-jeou administration, President Ma himself often told us that the Taiwan-strait, which for decades had threatened to be a zone of conflict and perhaps even war, was quickly being transformed into an avenue of peace, or so he said. For whatever reason, the international community, the diplomats, the academics, and the media also believed that peace was indeed at hand. Peace was good, we were told. It was good for business, and ultimately, it was good for humanity. For a little while, it did look like the two sides were on the brink of resolving their differences. Politicians from both sides of the Taiwan-strait were meeting repeatedly, and perhaps even more importantly, ordinary people, academics, journalists, students, businessmen, investors were also making contact through tourism and other activities. For many of them, this was for the first time. The two governments did tone down the rhetoric, and they also de-emphasized the military nature of relations in the Taiwan-strait. And again, this is something that most people globally did believe was indeed the case in Taiwan. However, absence of war does not mean absence of conflict, and absence of conflict certainly does not mean peace, and which is the subject of our talk today. And yes, President Ma Ying-jeou and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down together and toasted each other in Singapore in late 2015. But in the end, the very fundamentals of that conflict, the essence of the conflict in the Taiwan-strait, was never addressed. There never was peace, ever. It was all the politics of illusion. It was the illusion of peace. Nevertheless, again, the international community, having convinced itself that peace was at hand, attention shifted elsewhere, and the media turned to this part of the world, which certainly offers a series of opportunities for drama, from North Korea trying to develop nuclear weapons, to rampant human rights abuses in places like China, Myanmar, Cambodia, and recently in the Philippines, to war in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Syria. While the world was not paying attention, there was a storm brewing in Taiwan. A storm that would put the lie to the very notion that peace was finally arriving in the Taiwan-strait. That storm came to be known as the Sunflower Movement, which occupied Parliament in Taipei for 21 days in March and April 2014 over a controversial services trade agreement with China. Now, that storm was not something sudden. The seeds of that storm were sown throughout Taiwan's history, from its long, painful, traumatic history of invasion, of colonization, of massacres, like the 228 massacre of February 1947, to authoritarian rule from the Japanese during the White Terror under the KMT, a long history of exile, imprisonment, suffering, return to Taiwan, and then gradually economic development, liberalization, and in the end, during the 1990s, finally, democratization. So now, thanks to President Ma's efforts at rapprochement with China, all these differences, all these contradictions were really became evident to a number of Taiwanese. They were finally forced to look through the looking glass at themselves and ask themselves, what is Taiwan all about? So at a time when people were waxing eloquent about President Ma Ying-jeou, perhaps deserving the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to improve relations with China, for the Taiwanese themselves, it was very evident that the kind of peace that was being proposed to them was a peace of imposition. Ultimately, that peace, or the removal of the threat of war from China, was tantamount to submission. And recent developments in Hong Kong as well clearly made it demonstrated to the Taiwanese that an imposed peace on Chinese terms is not what they want for their own country. Again, that does not mean that the Taiwanese do not want peace, but they simply do not want that to be imposed. Now, during that period, a lot of people would say, well, then if the two sides came to better understand each other through contact, and this is something that many Chinese academics have said, then maybe perhaps the impediment to peace in the Taiwan-strait and reconciliation would be removed. Other people argue that if and when China democratizes, then those impediments to peace in the Taiwan-strait would finally be removed and the Taiwanese would be perhaps more amenable to unification or some form of unification with China. The problem with this approach or understanding of the Taiwan-strait is that ultimately the conflict itself stems from much more than simply different political systems that are either chosen or oftentimes imposed from above on the public. The notion of the nation itself is a matter of identity, it's a combination of values, of history, and yes, indeed, the political system as well that is liberal democratic for Taiwan and for many young Taiwanese, the only political system that they know. But again, differences in political systems are not the only determinants of the nation. And if that were the case, then fellow democracies like Canada and the United States, for example, would long ago have unified. Or former members of the British Empire, at least those that democratized over the years, would also at some point in their history been open to reunifying with the British Empire. Now, obviously this sounds rather preposterous, and my years in Taiwan have actually made it clear to me as well through my researches and my writing that the Chinese claims on Taiwan are themselves quite preposterous. Now, for the majority of those of us who live here, this is quite self-evident. I think ordinary Taiwanese, through their everyday lives, already give voice to that separate identity, even if they don't exactly know how to explain it or give it a voice. The problem is that freedom for Taiwan and Taiwan's future are not solely determined by the Taiwanese themselves. This is unfair, but this is the reality. If that were the case again, Taiwan would long ago have become a sovereign state. It would have established diplomatic relations, official diplomatic relations with a number of countries, and it would be a full participant in the community of nations. The reality is that this is a battle for geopolitics. Geopolitics is the stage where Taiwan must compete with China to get itself known and to earn the sympathy of the international community. Unfortunately, this is an area where Taiwan has not done particularly well over the years. Despite its many selling virtues, it is a successful democracy, it is a major economy, and it is a precious example in post-colonialism. Taiwan has not been able to use all that baggage of history and success to really tell its story to the international community and let people know worldwide why Taiwan matters. Now, this is something that the Taiwanese government itself, including the current administration, are not very good at, which leads me to conclude that it is every Taiwanese's responsibility to do what he or she can, using their own ways to tell to the rest of the world what Taiwan is all about. It is a challenge, and it is a challenge that should also be picked up by the Taiwanese overseas, most of whom have rebuilt their lives and in many cases cut all contact with their homeland. And unfortunately for Taiwan, the Chinese diaspora has been a lot more vocal and activist in spreading China's version of history and thus giving Beijing a major advantage over Taipei when it comes to public diplomacy. Taiwan has been very successful in business at exporting itself and its model globally, but in the world of public diplomacy, they have not been as successful. So now Taiwan really needs to stop thinking like an island and really join the community of nations and be vocal about what it is. It needs to learn to sell itself, not just its products. Now, definitely there is a role as well for Taiwanese of all stripes. Again, they need to find a language by which to explain why Taiwan matters to the international community. And by language, I don't just mean the written and spoken word. They need to find the language of emotion. They need to use the arts, culture, tourism to attract people and to make Taiwan better known to the international community. Right now, academic journals, academic conferences and volumes are of interest to a very narrow group of individuals who are not large enough or perhaps not even influential enough to make a difference in the Taiwan-strait. So really the Taiwanese need to find new ways, new models to really engage the international community in a more effective way. And it's quite surprising because despite all its virtues, Taiwan is very likely the most successful and certainly the most peaceful country on the face of the planet that faces an existential threat from a larger authoritarian regime. But despite the fact that it has the moral high ground, oftentimes it is ignored by the international community, or sometimes it is even compared to rogue regimes like North Korea or Zimbabwe, to use two examples. That is unfair, but that is the reality. Two other peoples who have been locked for several decades in a land issue are the Palestinians and the Israelis. Notwithstanding the fact that these two peoples have used over the years kidnappings, state terror, state violence, these two peoples have still succeeded in earning the respect and appealing to the international community and certainly to international sympathy. So we really need to ask ourselves, why is it that Taiwan, democratic, peaceful Taiwan, has not been able to earn for itself the kind of visibility and sympathy that states that behave much more dangerously, if you will, than Taiwan? So this is a question that I certainly would like to leave each and every one of you today with. And again, ultimately, what needs to be accomplished is to tell the community of nations why Taiwan matters. In a world that seems to have lost all sense in recent months, in recent weeks, with the assassination of foreign diplomats, or entire cities being destroyed in countries like Syria, and we will have speakers from war-torn Syria later this afternoon. Taiwan is a shining example of an alternative, of a different path, of a nation that came from a very dark and painful past and was able, without bloodshed, without destroying entire cities, to reinvent itself and to rebuild itself as a country, as a participant in the community of nations. I think this is an extraordinary accomplishment that the Taiwanese have not been vocal enough about internationally. They have been, in my opinion, a little bit too humble when it comes to their ability as a whole, as a people, regardless of the political parties that they vote for, to build a nation to achieve something quite extraordinary and precious in the face of immense external challenges, not only from China, but from a community of nations that more often than not chose to ignore it. Another reason why I believe Taiwan is very important and matters is the fact that the manner in which conflict in the Taiwan-strait will be resolved will very much be a determinant of the kind of China that the international community will have to deal with for decades to come. And this is very, very important. If we feed the beast by giving it what it wants in unjust terms for the Taiwanese, we will be creating a monster that will cause serious trouble for the community of nations again for decades to come. So, to make sure, or at least limit the possibility that Taiwan would be annexed by China, its best weapon is to make itself better known and better explain itself to the community of nations. Otherwise, if people ignore it, then China will easily get away with what it covers, which is ultimately to annex Taiwan. So definitely, knowledge is Taiwan's best ally to ensure its survival, and lack of knowledge and ignorance are its worst enemy. Thank you very much.